Live from ZTN studios in Harare, Zimbabwe. Welcome to the Mint Special Economic Panorama. Our discussion this afternoon, taking stock of the Transitional Stabilization Program, 5-year plan to supersede the TSP. This is part 2 of a series looking at the TSP, and today we focus on the new 5-year National Development Strategy to be implemented from January 2021. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimbabwe's TV network ZTN and our partners, Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, Ledriz, in association with Footloose Productions. Please also tune in to Economic Panorama on Capi Talk every Thursday at 7 p.m. Now, should you have any comments or views on our show this afternoon, please contact us via our Facebook page, Zimbabwe's TV network, or via our Twitter handle at ZTN News. Hello, I'm Andy Hodges. In 2018, government launched the Transitional Stabilization Program in a bid to set Zimbabwe's economy on a recovery path. The program, which runs from October 2018 to December 2020, was announced by Finance and Economic Development Minister Ntuli Ncube. The TSP set in motion a number of infrastructure projects spanning across energy, roads and social services, such as water and health provision. It focused on stabilizing Zimbabwe's macroeconomy, laying a foundation for sustainable and shared private sector-led growth. The government is now working on a new 5-year National Development Strategy, or NDS, to bolster infrastructure projects deemed crucial for the attainment of an upper middle income status by 2030. The NDS is set to be launched in September this year and will replace the Transitional Stabilization Program, TSP, which runs its course in December 2020. Joining us this afternoon to discuss Economic Panorama, taking stock of the Transitional Stabilization Program, 5-year plan to supersede the TSP, are Naomi Chakanya, Senior Researcher Economist at Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, Ledriz; Sekai Kuvarika, Chief Executive Officer at the Confederation of Zimbabwe Industries, CZI; and Sakile Sifalani Ngoma, Executive Director, Women in Politics Support Unit, WIPSU. Welcome to the Mint Special.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Now then, Naomi, before we begin our discussion on the new 5-year National Development Strategy, or NDS, can you quickly summarize the targets and objectives of the Transitional Stabilization Program, TSP?
Okay, thank you very much. I think TSP, from the onset, it had economic growth targets, which were placed at 9% economic growth rate from 2018 per year, from 2018 to 2021. And the growth rate was expected to stabilize to around 7% for the remaining years up to 2030. And there was an anchor around foreign direct investment as one of the drivers for economic growth. And there was also the aspect of focusing on various reform agendas. And TSP had 7 reform agendas. So there was a reform agenda on governance, reform agenda on service sector delivery, and there was also a reform agenda around macroeconomic imbalances, productive sector reforms, human development reforms, and social service reforms. So there were 7 key reform agendas that TSP was pursuing.
Okay, great. That gives us a good background. Now, Sekai, last week we took stock of the Transitional Stabilization Program, TSP, and if it attained the objectives set up by government. What elements do you believe constitute a national development strategy, and what form should it take?
Thank you, Andy. I think that I'm going to speak not necessarily to the elements in terms of the strategy itself, but the elements that would bring about what I think would be a good 5-year development plan or a national development strategy, if you may. You know, as I was walking up here, I was trying to remember where we were and where we are. And we have had such a prolonged crisis in this country that the crisis became an institution. I'm sure you are aware that I'm sure there's even a formation called Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition. That's how entrenched the crisis situation has become in the country. And it's a broad-based crisis. And I think that what we need to be able to do that is transformative is something that transforms that crisis into an economic growth coalition going forward. So I think this is the point where we have to remobilize and find each other again as the Zimbabwean economic economic actors or economic participants, and how do we craft, how do we put ourselves into an economic growth coalition which includes business, which includes labor, which includes our general society, which is inclusive of all the facets of our economy and society, as it were, and including government. I think that one of the observations that I have made is that we seem to be taking a consultative approach, where we expect the government to sit down and then begin to reach out to various components of our society and seeking views and inputs into a national development strategy. For me, that speaks to a lack of vision in the different facets of society. Okay. Because as business, we have a responsibility to articulate our own vision, and how that vision would serve greater society, how it would serve the economy of Zimbabwe going forward, how it would deliver jobs, how it would deliver a modern society in the country. And I think as such, other constituents must also have their own vision. And the job of our government must be to reconcile those visions into a national vision. But what I see is that we've got this top-down approach, and I think it's not government's fault. It's really also our fault. We have not given government our own sort of 5-year plans or 10-year plans. Like, this is the vision for us for the next 5 years. You find that in the social sector, for example, we are largely driven by the global agenda, you know, which we take the various global agenda as they are. We come here and we localize them. But we have not gone through an organic process of envisioning where we want to go. So when that happens, I think it becomes very difficult. It makes it a little bit more difficult for our government to come up with, because it's their responsibility at the end of the day to deliver a national development strategy. But I think we owe this country, and we owe our government.
I mean, as much as we say that, of course, it is government's role to come up with a strategy, with consultation, of course, but as well, but then it's down to business, private sector, individuals, companies, etc., to actually implement it on the ground, is it not? So therefore, it must be a collaborative, inclusive vision.
I would say that our national vision or our national development strategy must be a sum total of the different visions we have in the different facets of society. Because the consultative process, I think, has some flaws, because you are consulting on what? So we have a responsibility. Are we sure that labor, for example, has articulated where they want to see jobs and employment and whatever in the next 5 years? Are we sure that business has articulated that? Have we done that for education? Have we done that, the various facets of our society? Because then that makes it easy to implement that national development strategy. Because what then happens is government is able to articulate where we want to go, and is then able to facilitate the policies that would make those things happen.
Now, Sakile, Women in Politics Support Unit, WIPSU, represents the concept of women's political participation from a fringe policy issue to central issues in delivery on good governance and rights realization for women. With this in mind, what issues would you like to see addressed in the new NDS? And actually, let me be frank, your organization, why would you care about this?
Well, we care because we want to know where's the money for women's rights. I mean, it's a very simple thing. And I think I want to pick up on Sekai's point. I think actually that is the crisis that we have in the country. The economic crisis and the social crisis is that we don't see leadership at a national level. And perhaps the national development strategy is an opportunity to be able to coalesce something around it. Because I would counter to Sekai and say, actually, if you sit in the different sectors, people actually have articulated and have engaged and presented to government what their key proposals would be. And what remains, I think, is for government to collate and to engage on that. I speak confidently from the women's movement side. In fact, last year there was the significant economic indaba where, it was built on a long in-depth process of people actually engaging on what kind of economy women wanted in the different facets. The informal sector is highly organized and has also done its engagements on things like that. So I do think that, if we look at social protection, for example, we've worked extensively around on what can we do and how, looking at the constraints that the country has. I think what we're lacking is that leadership that says you have received from your multiple sectors proposals on how to go forward. And if government wants to take the opportunity to be progressive in this regard, I would challenge government to say, why don't you pick up from what Sekai is saying, collate what you have, and say, here's where we differ. Here's where we think we might not be able to reach. And we begin negotiations and rebuild the social contract, which is clearly what is the underlying crisis that we have, that we've lost the social contract in the country, and we don't fundamentally believe that, you're going to do what you say you're going to do, and we can't buy into the vision that you propose.
Now, Naomi, earlier this year, the Zimbabwe's Ministry of Finance announced that they will be rolling out an outreach program targeting all stakeholders to gather views as part of a wider stakeholder consultations. So what is the current state of affairs? Have consultations started? Has this program the Ministry of Finance announced started to be rolled out? I know COVID-19 may have put a bit of a hiccup in that, but has it started? And also, what is the best way they should have done? What's the best way Ministry of Finance should do this? Who should be consulted?
Okay, thank you. Well, a disclaimer that I'm not from the ministry, so I may not know exactly where the state of affairs is.
And but
yes, that's where I'm going now. So from a stakeholder coming from Labour, and as a citizen of Zimbabwe, we have heard that the government is in the process of developing that strategy or that plan. But actually we don't know where exactly the stage is. So I think it also backs down to the issue of how the process is being handled. Is everyone aware that this is a process that is ongoing, and how can we engage, and at what particular point in time is also very critical. So I think the ministry, in its endeavors, they should actually seek for probably enhanced communication strategies that allow all stakeholders to understand where the government is and what needs to be done in the whole process up to the final development of the strategy. And I think I want to concur with what Sakile has said. Over the years, what we have seen is that consultations are done ad hocly and abruptly, such that people don't have time to actually engage in the process. So I think going further, we would want to see a process whereby people are given time to consult their constituencies and to bring inputs to the forefront or to the ministry. And I think in doing that, we could probably address some of the weaknesses that we have had with such kind of consultation processes. And I also think that consultations should not be about just ticking the box that we have done the consultation, and then the world claims that Zimbabwe has got a very good, consultation process and strategy. But it's also about, when the consultations are done, what has been taken from the consultation, and it's the government taking the issues back to the community, to the citizens, that this is what we have gathered and this is what we have taken. Obviously, they cannot take everything. But I think that communication, we still have some gaps around that process. Yeah.
We'll have to take a short breather. If you have any comments or views on our show this afternoon, please contact us via our Facebook page, Zim Papers TV Network, or via our Twitter handle @ZTN News. You're watching the Min Special Economic Panorama. Our discussion this afternoon, taking stock of the Transitional Stabilization Program, 5-year plan to supersede the TSP. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV Network, ZTN, and our partners, Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, Ledriz, in association with Footloose Productions. After the breather, we will look at what are the critical success factors and policies that need to be included in the new NDS. The Min Special will be right back. Don't go away. Welcome back to the Mint Special Economic Panorama. Our discussion this afternoon, taking stock of the Transitional Stabilization Program 5-year plan to supersede the TSP. This is part 2 of our series looking at the TSP, and today we focus on the new 5-year National Development Strategy to be implemented from January 2021. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network ZTN and our partners, Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, Ledriz, in association with Footloose Productions. Please also tune in to Economic Panorama on Capi Talk every Thursday at 7 p.m. Naomi, we're now talking about critical success factors. So what would be the critical success factors and priorities that need to be realized for the NDS to be successful?
Okay, first of all, we pick up from where we have left. National ownership is critical. So getting everyone, most stakeholders involved in the process is one of the, so that people own this process. And whenever the government says we are rallying around this vision, everyone is aware of the vision and everyone subscribes to that vision. So national ownership is important. Implementing agreed positions is also very critical, because what we have seen is that we have got very good policies, we have got very good tenets in these policies, but when it comes to implementation, it's the other way around. So I think agreeing on what needs to be done and implementing what has been agreed is critical. I think the experiences from the tripartite negotiating forums that have happened is a clear example that we need to say, if we agree, let's go with this. And if there are challenges, the government should also come back to the stakeholders, you know, and give feedback on why certain things are happening. But right now what is happening is that you just wake up, there's a statutory instrument, you wake up, there's a new law, you wake up, you know, things have just turned upside down. So that does not give this strategy a success. We need to agree and implement what we have agreed.
So it's critical that everybody buys into a national development strategy. Otherwise, of course, it's someone else's strategy and doesn't
look
become
like
part
a donated strategy. So people won't understand, where are we going? Why should I be involved in this process? Okay.
Sakila, from a gender perspective or otherwise, what success factors or priorities would you like to be included? You talked about having this economic indaba, the huge economic indaba last year. So obviously that must have come out with some form of agreements or some form of priorities going forward. Maybe you could articulate some of that.
I think there has to be something in it for us at a very simple level. You know, what is going to be in it for the average Zimbabwean, and you know what is, and we don't talk about, you know, the average Zimbabwean looking at, you know, oh well, you know, there'll be, you know, maybe we'll stop user fees for maternities, for maternity hospital. These are little trinkets. We need to be able to see deep structural reforms that are actually going to put something meaningful and substantive in a sustainable way for citizens on the table. Otherwise, we're getting involved in a plan, an economic plan that prioritizes and gives privilege to people who are not Zimbabwean or people who are coming from outside, because they ostensibly are bringing in, you know, the mega deals, the big cash injection. So we need to be able to also put in elements around accountability, around the cash injection that Zimbabweans are putting into the fiscus. So we want things around issues of tax reform. It's been a long outstanding issues in multiple areas. We also want things around accountability for statutory funds. And I think when we use the word funds in Zimbabwe, it opens up a whole lot of conversations. But those are two critical areas that can put something meaningful for people on the table. And that's what we're looking for. Is there something in it for us?
Okay, is there something in it for us? Now, Sakai, I know business is very much focused on production, increasing the production and making sure that you can meet markets, not just here, but also internationally. But another critical factor, particularly highlighted in the TSP, was creation of employment. And the TSP said they were going to create 2.2 million jobs. And of course, that target was not met for various reasons. So employment is key to any country's economic growth. How do you think a national development strategy can succeed where the TSP failed? What needs to be done differently, do you believe?
I think first and foremost, we have to be honest about where we are. That's the sense you get is that sometimes we do our national plans from a point of, yes, we do aspire to move forward, but we don't acknowledge that this is where we are after maybe 2 years of trying or after 5 years of trying. So I think the starting point is really acknowledging where we are. And if we are looking at the TSP, we really have to be honest about what the TSP has managed to achieve and what it probably hasn't yet managed to achieve, and what is likely to be achieved by the end of the TSP in December 2020. So that becomes a good basis to start. Because if we base our assumptions for the 5-year plan on something that is not correct, then we are likely to set targets that are unattainable.
I want to pick up on that point, because you're right, because you can have a national development strategy with these fantastic targets, and then you don't hit them, and you feel like the program has let you down, when in fact the targets were too ambitious. And I think that's one of the issues.
That's one of the issues. And again, I think I just want to repeat what I said earlier. We need a new conversation. And this is a conversation that needs to take us to where we have a sense of building an economic growth coalition in the country. We need a new coalition in the country. From a crisis coalition, we now need a new coalition.
An economic development coalition.
Exactly. We now need a new coalition. And you spoke about jobs, and you know the economy has been bleeding jobs for a very long time because of the decline that has been prolonged. And for me, when I say we need to acknowledge where we are, we also need to acknowledge what we have. You know, when we talk about industrial development, we talk about special economic zones, we talk about industrial parks, we need to recognize what we have. We've got these industrial parks already. We've got them in Bulawayo, we've got them here in Harare. When we see other countries coming up with industrial parks in Ethiopia, and we are so excited and awed by what they've developed, we forget that we actually have that infrastructure here. We've got Belmont in Bulawayo, we've got Lighton, we've got Willowville. We just need, we were there before they started thinking about industrial parks and industrial hubs. So we need to acknowledge where we are and say, how do we bring these industrial parks where they were supposed to be a long time ago? How do we leapfrog them? Because we've got those already.
Okay, and I know Naomi wants to comment, so I'll come to you, Naomi. Are you saying that we need to be reality? We need to see reality first, because if we don't see reality, then obviously we can't build on something which isn't real. Yes. I think that's yeah. Naomi, you wanted to comment.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to add on to what she said around realistic targets. And if you look at TSP, even when we started reading the TSP when it was adopted, you were like 9% growth rate per year. I mean, from an economic perspective, it was, you'd have already seen that these are too ambitious targets for us. And then if we fail to get there, then we have to interrogate ourselves as well as what has made this process fail for us to get there. And I also want to point out that for this development strategy to be successful, there is need for stabilization in our economy. Right, stabilization. She was mentioning about industrial parks. We have the infrastructure, but what is making those infrastructure fail to leapfrog to take us to a better Zimbabwe we would want to see is because the environment to do business is constrained. It has a lot of constraints. For example, policy instability, policy inconsistencies. For example, the high cost of doing business. The latest figures that we have from the Doing Business report, Global Doing Business report, is saying that Zimbabwe is number 140 out of 190 countries. So you can already see we are there at the bottom. And these are the indicators that investors would want to see for them to come and invest. We have got other African countries who are doing well, even in our region, who are in the top 50. And it's attractive for investors to come there. So we really need to set our priorities right. And I also want to add to say we need to ensure that our politics don't override economic rationale. I think we just have to be frank about that in Zimbabwe and see how we move forward around that issue.
Now, the issue about anything, whether it's the TSP or the new national development strategy, of course, it's anchored on money. I think Sakile mentioned this earlier. How do you fund this? How do you get the money to boost production? How do you get the money for infrastructure projects, particularly in view of Zimbabwe's lack of access to foreign currency or access to lines from African Development Bank is one of our partners, and FXM Bank, of course, but the Paris Club is not. The IMF, of course, has issues. The World Bank has issues. European Investment Bank, we owe them money. So what financing model should the government utilize for the new NDS, and I know that people tell me domestic resource mobilization, but when 96% of government's income is from taxation, well, I would say that we're pretty much overly taxed in Zimbabwe.
Exactly.
So how do you think that Zimbabwe can finance any new development strategy, and what model should we use?
Okay, first of all, I think we have to start by looking inwardly. Yes, of course, you have said domestic resource mobilization, but that's where we need to start. Where are we getting wrong? Why is it that we are not seeing the money being invested in the economic policies that we have set ourselves?
I mean, today there was a report today we're losing $1 billion in smuggling.
That's where I wanted to go now. That's why I said let's look internally as Zimbabwe. Our challenge in Zimbabwe is not about lack of resources, lack of funds. We have seen from the Auditor General's report how much public money is misused. I think this is public information. So the question is around how do you ensure that we have good stewardship of the national resources that we have, right? So it's not a problem of we don't have money. I mean, all the sagas that are going around are telling us that the money is there, but it's also about reprioritization of those expenditures that we do. So I think one of the key areas that we really need to focus on going forward with this policy is about how does the government reprioritize its expenditure and make sure that its expenditures are used efficiently.
Well, on that note, we'll have to take a short breather. We'll come back to Sakila. I think she wants to comment on that. We'll do it after the break. If you have any comments or views on our show this afternoon, please contact us via our Facebook page, In Papers TV Network, or via our Twitter handle @ZTN News. You're watching the Mint Special, our discussion this afternoon, taking stock of the Transitional Stabilization Program, or TSP, 5-year plan to supersede the TSP. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV Network, ZTN, and our partners, Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, Ledriz, in association with Footloose Productions. Now, in our final segment, we ask, what are the constraints or otherwise that the Zimbabwe government faces in the successful implementation of a new national development strategy? And what proposals do our panelists have for inclusion in the new NDS? The Mint Special will be right back. Don't go away.
Life will never be the same again.
Absolutely. How do you tell someone in Mbare or in Soweto that they should exercise social distancing?
Every single one of us, barring a few, are praying more.
What is the health economic cost of what we are trying to achieve?
I don't know whether his chairman knows he runs at about 9 in the morning.
Yeah, I've just got the symptoms, so I just called the doctor and then he just advised me to have to stay at home,
Welcome back to the Mint Special Economic Panorama. Our discussion this afternoon, taking stock of the Transitional Stabilization Program, 5-year plan to supersede the TSP. This is part 2 of our series looking at the TSP, and today we focus on the new 5-year National Development Strategy to be implemented from January 2021. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV Network, ZTN, and our partners, Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, Ledriz, in association with Footloose Productions. Please also tune in to Economic Panorama on Capitalk every Thursday at 7 p.m. Now, Naomi, before I ask you my next question, I just wanted to read you something. In the latest African Economic Outlook 2020 report, the AFDB, African Development Bank, says Zimbabwe will emerge stronger from the prevailing health and economic crisis through optimum exploitation of its vast natural resources riding on public infrastructure, skilled labor force, as well as fiscal and monetary policy interventions. But then bearing in mind, of course, inflation came out for June in Zimbabwe at 737.26%. That is down slightly from April of 765.57%. A new auction rate that came out as well yesterday, 68.88 to $1 US, successful bids of around 16 million US. So bearing those issues in mind in the comments from the AFDB, what are the economic constraints or challenges currently being faced by the Zimbabwe government? And how in the new national development strategy do you suggest they can be addressed?
Okay, the challenges, I think it's a myriad of challenges that the government is facing. I think first of all, we have to do with institutional reforms. I think we have been trapped for a long time with institutions, public institutions, for example, parastatals that have inefficiencies surrounding them, and that's a weak institution trap that the government needs to really address. We also have a challenge of the lack of let me say fiscal discipline. The lack of fiscal discipline is one of the challenges that the government is facing, and it has resulted in us having all these various challenges that we have been having. And I also want to stress on the issue of the lack of ad hoc dealing with the issue of currencies in Zimbabwe. You have mentioned the auction, the forex auction, which was recently introduced. But already we are seeing that it is highly exclusionary. Look, our Zimbabwean economy is full of players who are at a small scale. We have those who are at large scale. But those small scale players are not involved in this because of the thresholds that
the 500,000.
Yes, 500 that it has
50,000.
placed. Already you have the majority of your population, the majority of your businesses being blacked out from the system. So we need to find a way, an inclusive way of dealing with this. And from the social humanitarian crisis, I think we have so much to address. I think the COVID crisis has even escalated the challenges that we have. So I think going forward, in terms of what the tenets of a development strategy I would want to see is one that prioritizes the people, the citizens. Here I'm talking of enjoyment of socio-economic rights. We need a budget that speaks to that development strategy that we have, but ring fences resources for social protection. I think COVID has exposed that we don't have any proper safety nets. And the 2019 labor force survey is saying only 2% of the population is covered by any form of social security. So which means 98% of our population are just at risk of falling into deeper poverty. So I think going further, this development strategy should prioritize the issue of social service delivery because it is an enhancer, an enabler to economic development. And I also want to see a development strategy that also does not put employment as an add-on issue. We want to see issues of employment cutting across all the various sectors. And we want this strategy to speak to the targets of employment that are realistic in nature. In fact,
we had an economist who said that whatever program they come up with, it should be linked to jobs. So if you want to do production, how much jobs? If you want to do this, how many jobs are you going to create?
I can tell you in Rwanda, one of the good practices, some of us, we ask why some of these countries are doing well. Whenever a ministry is given resources, it should come back to report how many jobs have been created by their ministry. And that is your ticket to the next bidding that you're going to get. But here in Zimbabwe, we focus on expenditure, but not on the results of those expenditures. So I want to see something good coming out of a process where we are results-oriented, not expenditure-oriented. Yeah.
Now, Sakila, I'd like you to also comment on that, but I also want to ask you this. How do you think, I think Sakai alluded to this earlier in one of the earlier segments, how do we enhance implementation capacity? How do we make sure that the new economic plan is successfully implemented? Because I think both the other panelists mentioned this, that we have great plans in Zimbabwe, we're very good at reports. I think that's one of the things people say about Zimbabweans, is implementation where we're let down.
I think the first one is to have a new government to deliver it. And when I say new government, I don't mean going to elections. I mean to say that the administrative and operational capacities of our government, the public sector reforms that had initially been actually proposed and tabled by the president, need to come back onto the table. During the period of the TSP, that particular agenda has basically whittled away. We need to see it coming back. You need to be able to have beyond just the parastatals, you need to be able to have ministries and government departments and agencies being newly built, newly organized to deliver on efficiency and effectiveness. And we don't have that, which is why, we've got delays in implementations.
Bureaucracy.
it's bureaucracy, but it's also inefficiency. Our public sector hasn't, undertaken reforms it ought to have done in the late 90s, and we are sitting with a public sector that was built for purpose maybe for 20 years ago. We are in a completely different era, so we really need to be able to say what kind of public sector do we want, and it doesn't mean just chopping off of the jobs of agrarian workers. Or it means redoing the institution that delivers services and holds access to the keys to treasury. The second part of it is that we need to be serious about stewardship. I think it is a scandal in this country that mining royalties are labeled under miscellaneous. Simple things like that, administrative reforms. If it is miscellaneous, therefore it is not something that you focus on. It is not something that you pay attention to. So if you look at that 96%, the tax revenue that's driving the economy, these Zimbabweans are they are investors of this economy. And if we look at that 96%, it's like toothpaste. When the toothpaste is coming to an end and we're squeezing and we're squeezing and we're squeezing. And yet the resources that we talk about, when everyone talks about Zimbabwe, we say, oh, well, we've got resources. And I noticed that the ADFB report makes reference to the resources. But the resources are not part of the central kitty. That's just the reality. The resources that we make from our mines, the resources we make from our natural resources, from the animals, from the parks, those funds don't sit in the consolidated revenue fund. So we can't even begin to talk about a meaningful budget because the budget itself is excluding the larger pockets of resources that we actually have. And if we don't talk about that, what is the point? So government really needs to sit down and have a hard think and say, do we actually want to do this or not? And if they can't do that at a practical, demonstrable level, because my point is, that is what the government can immediately control. Before it controls me, it can control itself. Let government demonstrate its commitment by reforming itself and saying we are ready to go to the next bit of this program. And I'll buy into it.
Now, Sakai, the government's own estimates of negative growth rate in Zimbabwe. I mean, they're looking at their own Ministry of Finance said 15 to 20% possibly for 2020 negative. I think the IMF has put it around over 6.5 or 7% negative. Does this call for economic policies, radical economic policies, to be implemented in the new NDS? And I want you to be specific here. Have the CZI, you talked earlier about how possibly private sector, including businesses, let themselves down by not articulating their vision or coming up with a comprehensive vision themselves to government. So I'm going to put you on the spot here. What proposal would the CZI give to the government for inclusion in the NDS, if you have any specifics?
Okay. So I'll speak offhand about a few specific things. One is that Naomi spoke about looking inwards. We have to promote policies that will promote self-sufficiency, one, and that will promote the recovery of what we already have. And by doing that, I think we understand we are in a limited economy in terms of funding and financing for local investment. And we are taxpayers. We give money to government at various levels as employees and as businesses. And we want that money to stimulate economic growth, not just to go to finance consumption or other things. And by saying that, what we would propose is a situation where a whole lot of that money is plowed back into the economy through local procurement. And through local procurement, that promotes our businesses. This situation where we do a lot of external procurements, where we are importing, our government may be importing things that they are not supposed to be importing because there's local capacity to produce those things. When they procure locally, they stimulate economic growth because then they are bringing back tax resources, tax revenue into the industries to allow them to finance operations, which is not possible otherwise because we have limited sources of funding. The other is that we really need to stamp corruption. And by saying that, I mean, when we have a lot of middlemen that are part of the procurement chain in this country, I'm glad to say that I think the procurement authorities are engaging with us at the moment to try and find a solution to some of these problems. When we finance middlemen, we finance consumption. We do not finance production because that money is not reinvested into the creation of jobs or into the expansion of industrial activities. It goes to buy trinkets and luxuries and other, things to show off from middlemen companies. So we cannot afford to have an economy where middlemen are able to flaunt wealth and riches, and
business
while
is suffering.
business is gasping for air, and that air is that money. So the taxpayers' money should really be plowed back into industry, and I think that's one of the key recommendations that we are making. The second one is that we've got these industrial areas that I've already spoken about. When we are now talking about special economic zones, I would say let's turn all our industrial areas into special economic zones. Come up with a special program for the next 5 years that will revitalize and revive all those, give them the incentives that they require, so that we focus on reviving our local industries. Yes, we want foreign direct investment, but we do want to keep our local industries alive, and they will be able to also stimulate growth and create jobs. So those two are key for me, and let's have a very deliberate and aggressive industrial policy. I
think that's interesting because it follows what Naomi was saying, a policy or a national strategic policy which is people-orientated. And I think that's one way of being people-orientated, is support our own business, buy our own products, what we call Buy Zimbabwe, I suppose, if that's the way of putting it. Sorry, you wanted to quickly...
I wanted to quickly add that, so we've got a lot of other social inclusion issues that we talk about. We talk about social protection. Those things need to be funded. And I think first and foremost, our policies must deliver production and growth so that we are able to fund these. Let's be very intentional about achieving them, but let's be very deliberate about what will deliver that.
Because if we get that, then we have tax revenues increased, we have more money for the fiscus to be able to spend on social protection and so on. So
otherwise, we want to share what is not there. We will sit and argue as government and society about not sharing equitably, not having this in this place. But where is that? So we really need a very aggressive industrialization drive. If this national development strategy is going to be about anything, let it be about reindustrializing this country.
Now, this is my final question as we are coming to the end of the program. What is the role of government, private sector, development agencies and research organizations in crafting a development strategy?
Okay, that's a mouthful. Okay, I think from the researcher's perspective, I think it's always critical to provide technical inputs that are evidence-based, and trade unions, civil society organizations are well versed in doing that. But however, when we develop those technical inputs, we expect the government to also be sincere about addressing the issues that are coming out of these evidence-based, because we are more closer to the communities and the constituencies. And I think the role of the government going forward now, sometimes it's not about reinventing the wheel, but sometimes it's also about learning best practices from other countries. Right, and the last thing is that I want to see a development strategy that does not just speak about economic indicators, GDP 5%, GNI of per capita of 5,000 by 2030. What does that mean to an ordinary citizen? What does it mean to me as a woman? What does it mean to a youth who's just coming out of school? What does that figure mean? So I want to see a trajectory where we redefine growth in this country. We don't want growth that is associated with jobless growth. We don't want to see growth that is associated with futureless, squandering resources for the future.
Well, on that note, we have come to the end of our program. You have been watching the Mint Special Economic Panorama. Our discussion this afternoon, taking stock of the Transitional Stabilization Program 5-year plan to supersede the TSP. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network ZTN and our partners, Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, Ledriz, in association with Footloose Productions. Don't miss Economic Panorama on Capitalk every Thursday at 7 p.m. All that's left for me is to thank our panelists, Naomi Chakanya, Senior Researcher, Economist at the Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, Ledriz, Sekai Kuvarika, Chief Executive Officer at the Confederation of Zimbabwe Industries, CZI, and Sakile Sefalani Ngoma, Executive Director, Women in Politics Support Unit, WIPSU. Ladies, thank you very much for being on the Mint Special.
Thank you for having us.
A final comment. It is clear that Zimbabwe needs to formulate and implement integrated productive development policies for sustainable economic growth. However, for any such policy to work, it will need inclusive stakeholder collaboration and buy-in. It must always be remembered that the government proposes and implements policies, and it is down to the private sector individuals and to a lesser degree CSOs and donors to effectively implement the policies on the ground. No economic policy in Zimbabwe can work without the full participation of all. The government has called for all stakeholders with contributions toward the NDS to send them to Zimbabwe's Secretary for Finance, Mr. George Givamatanga. Zimbabweans must grab this opportunity with both hands so as to be part of and contribute to the new 5-year National Development Strategy for Zimbabwe. Don't let this opportunity go begging. Get involved. Let your voice be heard. Be part of Zimbabwe's economic future. I'm Andy Hodges. Goodbye, and you all be safe.